So it's a great honour and pleasure to be able to interview Garry Runciman, who I've known for some years. Garry, I always start by asking when and where a person was born.
I was born in London in 1934.
Right. Which part of London?
My mother gave birth in the London clinic, which was regarded as normal form.
Yeah. And then it's interesting, people are shaped by their ancestry, and I suggest to people that they might like to tell me and others who watch this something about their forebears. And I jokingly say you can go back to the Norman Conquest, but one or two people have taken me up on this and gone back to the Norman Conquest. So you don't have to do that, but usually people start with their grandparents and say something if they knew them about who they were and what they did.
No, well, I do in fact have one memory of my great-grandfather, and I'm pretty sure it's authentic, because it's a memory of a very old man in a deep chair with something funny white on top of his shoes. The answer being that he was wearing spats. He must have been 88 or 9 in those days, and he was one of the many children of a Methodist lay preaching coast guard on the northeast coast. He ran away to sea, literally, at the age of 12, made good, which of course many like him didn't, and died in his 90th year, a millionaire shipowner. He had one son who went into politics, was a Liberal member of Asquith's cabinet, and to the extent that he now features in the history books, it's because of his ill-fated mission when he was called out of retirement by Neville Chamberlain in 1938 to go and soften up Benesch about, in effect, appeasing Hitler by letting him have the Sudetenland. All that was, of course, overtaken by events, well known and well documented. My father was just young enough not to be in the First World War. He was an amateur pilot. He was the founder of an auxiliary air force squadron. And when the Second World War came, he would have expected to lead it into the Battle of Britain. But by that time, he'd been made the head of BOAC, as it then was, which meant that he was in a reserved occupation, running the civil airlines. And by the time that came to an end, he was too old to fly. But I don't know to what extent anything in my subsequent life and persona was influenced by any of them, but that's the background from which I come.
To explain something, when I looked you up on Wikipedia, your motto is something like by sea.
It is that, yes, because my great-grandfather, I think he effectively bought a baronetcy. I think he was a Liberal member, and I think contributions, I've always rather assumed that contributions to party funds. But I think my family is one of only two where his son, my grandfather, after my great-grandfather had been made a peer, my grandfather was elevated to a rank above his own father in his own father's lifetime. And my grandmother told me once of a conversation she had with King George V, in which the king said to her that he thought it was a bit off, or however he put it, of her father-in-law to have taken a peerage, and of course they were all hereditary in those days, without consulting his own son about it, when his own son still had hopes of holding high office in the House of Commons. To which my grandmother, so she says, said, well, I think my father-in-law does genuinely believe he's going to live to be 100, to which the king said, well, yes, that's the least he could do.
Lovely. So, moving to your grandparents' generation, this is all on your father's side. Did you know
Yes.
the other side at all?
My mother was half French, half American. She was the, let me get this right, granddaughter, I think. The family name on that side was, they were Huguenot French, Garrison, by the time it was
This is why your middle name is Garrison.
And this is why my middle name is Garrison. And somebody known as, in the family as the Commodore was again, in a way, it parallels my own great-grandfather. I mean, these were the days in which fortunes were made in ways which sometimes were more and sometimes less ethical. And Commodore Garrison, my forebear on my mother's side, made the mistake when Vanderbilt was out of the country in Europe of trying, I think probably the right word is to double-cross him over some deal involving the Staten Island ferry or goodness knows what in New York. And a letter survives in the New York Public Library in which Vanderbilt got back from Europe, rumbled what was going on, and wrote a 2-line letter to Commodore Garrison saying, "Sir, in my absence in Europe, you attempted to ruin me. I will now ruin you." In which the very sensible reaction of Commodore Garrison was to head straight out to San Francisco, where he got himself elected as the reform mayor and proceeded to stitch up the ferries across San Francisco Bay and made a large fortune in California, none of which survived down to my mother's generation, because her father actually went bankrupt in the early years of the 20th century, and her mother took her and her 2 sisters back to France, brought them up in France, and never saw her husband again.
Amazing. The American side was obviously very influential on you.
Well, I don't know to what extent it was, but because of that connection that my mother and I spent most of the Second World War in the United States. And I do have a very clear memory of the ship taking us across the Atlantic, and of the moment when these mothers and children were all assembled, and there was an announcement over the tannoy that the ship in front of us had been torpedoed off the American coast. Now, I was young enough that I don't remember being in the least alarmed by this news. We all had to wear our little life jackets until the ship arrived safely in New York. But just as I have one recollection of an air raid in Bristol shortly before we left, my recollection is simply of being rather indignant at being dragged away from a window down into the cellar because I was looking at all the searchlights and hearing the bangs coming from the dock. And it simply never occurred to me that these German aeroplanes would drop a bomb on us.
Were those your first memories, or do you have earlier ones?
I don't think I have any earlier ones really than 1940. I was 5 years old.
5 years. Tell me something. I mean, have you got brothers and sisters?
No, only child.
Tell me something about the character of your parents. Were they nice to you? Were they intellectual? Were they?
My father was very conventional in his opinions, and I would say rather unimaginative. My mother was much more imaginative. I always felt that she was to some extent an ally in terms of my not conforming to my father's rather stereotypical view as to what sort of person his only son ought to be. But my father had been married before. We had a short and unsuccessful marriage to the novelist Rosamund Lehman.
Really?
And he must have been about 30 when he met my mother in England. They married in in 1932, and I was born in 1934.
Did you ever meet Runciman Langham?
Never did. I would always have been curious to, but it never so happened. But,
so tell me about your first school. You must have gone to a sort of school of about 6 or 7, did you?
In New York, I went to a day school in Manhattan. When we came back in 1945, my father had arranged for me to go to let's call it an unreconstructed English preparatory school called Highfield, which I loathed.
I've heard of it, yeah.
And the irony is that his father, in the First World War, had sent him to a school which I think also still exists, called Summerfields, which he disliked so much that he vowed that if he ever had a son, he would not send his son to Summerfields.
Summerfields, the Oxford.
Yes, yes. So instead, he sends me to a school called Highfield, which I disliked so much that I vowed I would never send a son of mine to it. And I'm amazed that it still survives. The headmaster in those days was a canon of the established church, a red-faced, corpulent, pince-nosed cleric who, for one category of misdemeanour, you would be beaten in the morning by his walking stick, and for a lesser category of misdemeanour, you would be spanked with a slipper, having taken down your pyjama bottoms. I'm sure he had a wife and children. I'm sure he was a man of total repute. But a parental complaint would probably put him behind bars nowadays.
I went to those schools, that kind of school. Were you a boarder at the school, or?
Oh yes.
Boarding from the age of 6.
Well, it took boarders from the age of. But I mean, I was, when I got back from America, was 10. I still had an American accent, which of course was not a very sensible
attribute.
not a helpful attribute. No. Yes, my reaction on getting an invitation as an alumnus to celebrate, could it be 100 years, or anyway, was that I'd be delighted if I could bring a can of petrol and a box of matches with me.
Did you say that? Did you?
And I didn't actually say that, but the headmaster, whose nickname was Bug, appears in a memoir by Ludo Kennedy, if you know who I mean, who was at the same school in the war, who wrote a letter when he was asked back, saying he would never wished to have anything to do with the school again. Then found, to his surprise, in the summer of 1940, I think, when he was a young sub-lieutenant on the Dover Patrol, that he got another invitation, which was through the instrumentality of the school secretary, a nice elderly lady, very unfairly nicknamed Witch by the boys, who had, I think, rather a crush on Ludo. So he gets an invitation and thinks, well, I might as well look in, because he was on leave, before going off in pursuit of more adult pleasures in the West End or elsewhere, and couldn't think why he was so frostily greeted by Bug, the clerical headmaster, until he remembered what he'd done the year before and just how offensive the letter had been which he'd written.
So you went there from 10 to 13, did you?
Yes.
I mean, were you a sporting lad, or?
No, I was never. Not shamefully bad, but always rather envious of the people who did have serious athletic skills.
Were there any hobbies that you were particularly enthusiastic about at that point in your life?
Not that I can recall, no. I used to spend quite a lot of holidays in the country, sometimes with my grandmother, my father's mother, with whom I had a rather good relationship. But looking back, what I regret about it is that I was just of the age, I was self-centred schoolboy prig, And she would have loved to talk to me about how badly Mr. Lloyd George treated your grandfather in politics and so forth. And of course, I just thought, Lloyd George, you, my father, I wanted to talk about me. And it was such a wasted opportunity because she could have, if I'd been just a few years older, I would have been so interested. She lived into her mid-80s. To hear her recollections of, and she herself, she and my grandfather were the first two people to both sit in the House of Commons together.
Gosh.
No, she was no feminist. She'd been at Girton in the 1880s, got a first-class degree, but of course she couldn't then take up the degree. But as far as she was concerned, once she married, no thought of a career ever occurred to her. She went into Parliament purely to keep a safe seat warm for my grandfather at the next election. And she regarded that as part of her duty to him, nothing to do with making a career for herself.
What a pity, yes, you didn't talk to her.
I know, it is.
Because at what age were you when she died?
It was the year of Suez in 1956.
Well, you were quite...
So I was then. I was then of an age that yes.
22, so you could have...
But by then I'd done 2 years national service and was not very grown up, but grown up enough that I could have got much more out of seeing and talking to her than I did when I saw a lot of her when I was younger.
And then you went on to public school.
Yes, it was taken to be a matter of course that I would go to Eton. It was thought probable, and that turned out to be right, that I would get an entrance scholarship. And that was, I never questioned, I never thought of any other alternative, and no other alternative was ever put to me.
Were you happier there?
Yes, on the whole I rather liked it.
What particular memories do you have of that? I mean, did you get involved in dramatics or music or?
No, I mean I was lucky because there is a sort of, it's not quite a schoolboy's governing body, but it's called the Eton Society, known as POP, yes.
Yes.
Purely because I wasn't athletic, as I've said, but purely because of the people I knew, I was elected into it, and I ended as it's the most senior person and therefore as the president of it. So to that extent, I was a successful schoolboy. But yes, it doesn't mean very much.
I mean, Eton has so much mythology wound around it. I mean, was there some of the things you disliked about the previous school, like bullying or hazing or any of that?
No, none of that. There was, as far as I was ever aware, very little homosexuality. It would be gossiped about. I'd be astonished to be told that in the house that I was at, there was ever a case of it. I was conscious of the fact, which indeed was the only reason I think I might have ever to have wished that I'd gone somewhere else, of the very narrow, socially speaking, catchment area. I mean, we were all a bunch of privileged rich kids. And I came later, not exactly to envy, but to wish that I hadn't been so confined during my teens to the companionship of boys, and only boys, of my own class.
I mean, it's tempting to link this in some way with your first and one of your most well-known books, Relative Deprivation and Social Justice. Do you think any seeds were sown?
No, I don't.
There's certainly plenty of relative deprivation people didn't go to. No. I mean, we'll come to in terms of academic work there, did you toy with science at all, or?
It was taken as a matter of course that if you were a clever boy, you would do not only Latin but Greek. And I was taught in the sixth form by Richard Martineau, whom I liked very much, and who then subsequently, after he retired from Eton, taught classics in Cambridge at Magdalen. And I've sometimes thought, what a waste, why didn't I learn something useful? But I have to say, I think it was genuinely educative to be well taught the classics, as it used to be called. And I have sometimes been grateful for it in my later academic life, for the fact that I can deal with the sources in Latin and Greek for things I'm academically interested in.
But your most recent work has bordered on some of the sciences, hasn't it? And, biology and evolutionary biology and so on. Do you think it would have been helpful to have done a little bit of that at Eton?
No, I doubt if it would have made any difference. I mean, that
things have changed so much.
Yes, I don't think so. But I mean, purely in parenthesis, I have immensely enjoyed the revelation that Sir John Gurdon, as he now is, whom I remember as a red-headed schoolboy at Eton, was told by his science master that he was too stupid to do science, and as we all know, ended up with a Nobel Prize in medicine and an institute in Cambridge named after him. But because yes, I mean, we were all aware at the time that science was not very well taught at the school, and it was very rare for clever boys to go on to pursue a university and post-university career in natural science. Maths, that's different, as it always was traditionally in the curriculum, both at Oxford and Cambridge.
And again, you weren't outstandingly interested in games or sports.
I enjoyed them. I think in my last year, if enough people came down with flu, I would be hauled into the school squash team, of which the captain was Michael Holroyd, subsequently the biographer, who was quite seriously good. But as in all these things, there are heights beyond heights, and I don't think. As far as I remember, I don't think Holroyd was ever up to the sort of national amateur championship level, which Nigel Broomfield, whom I remember, was. But no, I was not. I was a respectable but relatively unsuccessful games player.
I mean, you mentioned one teacher. Were there any other teachers who you admired and influenced you?
Not, I think, in terms of saying, as some people do, my interest was first kindled in, but I think the history teaching was good, and Robert Burley arrived as headmaster, and I have to say he was one of those who was slightly more likely to put off rather Philistine 17-year-olds by his enthusiasm for the greatness of the Divine Comedy and so on. But that said, no, it was something of a privilege to be taught by somebody as well qualified as that, to try and galvanise interest in whatever it was.
Were you at all interested in politics at school?
No. Not interested in that sense of being political, but there was something called the Political Society, which invited speakers down who on the whole were prepared to come. There was a story which, for all I know, may be legendary, but it must be based on something, that Ernest Bevin agreed to come and talk to the Eton schoolboys. Began by telling them about the organisation of the trade unions in Britain, broke off and said, "I can see I'm boring you out of your minds," and proceeded to ad-lib about the techniques that you need in order to retain the attention of a hostile audience in a political meeting. But what I do remember was it became my turn, as it were, to be the secretary for one half, as they were called at Eton, meaning one term, and writing the letters to whoever it was agreed should be invited to speak. And I wrote a letter to Richard Dick Crossman, who agreed to come, and then I got a letter from him the day before he was due to arrive, saying, and he would like, after the dinner and his speech, when normally they would all go back on the train to London, he would like to stay overnight and to be given a tour of the school in the morning. And so I took this letter rather nervously to the provost's wife, who I could see was furious at the presumption of this Labour politician, thinking that he could ask a favour, could invite himself to stay in the provost's lounge. But he did give a very interesting talk about what it was like as a Wykamist, joining the Labour Party out of the hostility of the trade union MPs to people like himself. And equally interesting was Jim Callaghan, who agreed to an invitation, was a great success by telling this assembled group of privileged little teenagers that he had absolutely no objection to the school. His objection was to the fact that it was people like us who were getting the benefit of this education and not people like his constituents in South Wales. And he was roundly cheered for that. And years later, I found myself sitting next to Jim Callaghan at some big city dinner. And I reminisced to him about this, about which he was absolutely delighted. And he wrote me a charming letter saying, it just goes to show how careful we should be when addressing the young, which we seldom are. Yours, Jim Callaghan.
How sweet.
Yes.
Very nice. One thing that often happens at such an age is that one goes through confirmation. Were you confirmed?
No, my family were so low church. I mean, even my great grandfather was a Methodist, as was normal, and as I say, his father had been a Methodist lay preacher. My grandparents didn't have any of their children. They had 5 children, baptized or confirmed. I was neither baptized nor confirmed. My mother was a lapsed Catholic because she'd been at a convent school during the First World War in England, although her mother brought her up in France, as I was saying, but she would go to a convent school called, I think, Mayfield in the south of England, and then come back in the holidays. And she was one of those who, at the age of 18, just thought this is a load of nonsense, and never went to Mass. And at the very end of her life, I once said to her, I thought I should at least ask, did she want me to get in touch with the Jesuits at Farm Street or wherever it was to arrange for last rites. Absolutely no interest in that at all.
And how about you? I mean, have you had an interest or involvement?
No, it's curious because I've often wondered since whether, even take the dreadful canon headmaster, how many of the people teaching how many school teachers generally who are ostensibly subscribed to the tenets of the Christian faith actually believe in it themselves. I mean, quite clearly, most of the people I was taught by at Eton, I mean, they went through the motions of assigning things called Sunday questions, about the problem of evil, to which the conventional answer was some version of a Christian answer. I mean, it was all there in the ethos. But again, of the parents who came down for the confirmation of their children, it was purely a social rite. I used to wonder whether the chaplains themselves actually believed all this stuff. But it was part of the standard curriculum. We took it as a matter of course. But I never got religion, as you might say.
You didn't? You never had any firm belief at any point in some supernatural power of...
Well, I've always thought that nobody has an explanation as to why anything exists or any of us are here at all. And I'm not in the least surprised that religion, in some sense, is, as far as we know, can be called a cultural universal. Human beings do wonder what it's all about, and know perfectly well. I mean, in this context, the quotation which always comes first to my mind is Marcus Aurelius, saying it's perfectly obvious gods exist, whoever or whatever they are, because we experience their power. Well, that seems to me a very sensible reaction to the world in which we find ourselves. But how you get from there to the tenets of the Christian religion, I find quite extraordinary.
And what have you been following at all the kind of atheist versus Christian disputes around Dawkins and Richard Dawkins and others?
Well, I think of other people who have said to Richard Dawkins, why do you go on about this? Because it doesn't, it puts some people off taking seriously what you ought to be taken seriously about. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, I know. And clearly, I mean, he has a very strong and understandable aversion to what the idiotic doctrines which get propagated in the name of religion.
Quite a lot of the people I've interviewed in Cambridge colleges, including masters, who have to preside at rituals in King's or Trinity,
yes,
they usually say, well, I don't believe it, but I like the music. Or
yes, and I think I would say the same. And certainly, I mean, if I'm going to a funeral, I always rather hope that the funeral will be in the standard Church of England form, because the words are familiar. It has all these resonances, and it still seems possible. It's not in a beautiful country churchyard and having these things recited over you that you have to testify to the resident vicar the deceased had never been to church in his life or her life.
Right, so Trinity was the obvious next step or not?
Yes, it was simply taken for granted. It was again assumed.
Why Trinity rather than King's?
Because my father and grandfather had both been there.
So,
and it was assumed that I would get there on the scholarship, which indeed I did. And it was also assumed, which I should have perhaps stood out against, because my tutor at Trinity was that lovely man John Morris, who spent decades of his life getting a Greek trireme reconstructed and in working order. And he made it quite clear to me that he was horrified at the thought that, having arrived in Cambridge on an entrance scholarship in classics, I should do other than read classics. And in those days it was the unreformed Part 1 classical tripos.
2 year?
For 2 years, in which I got a first class with distinction. That meant nothing other than the fact that I had been trained, by the time I left Eton, to turn 12 lines of Shakespeare, sight unseen and without books, into 20 lines of Sophoclean iambics. And it's an extraordinary skill to inculcate into anybody, and its educative value, I must say, I think is minimal. But luckily, in the Cambridge system, as you know, I could change having done this, and I did Part 2 history in 1 year.
1 year.
And did very well in that, but not least by the fact that there was a special subject taught by Australian classical historian called Alec MacDonald,
Yeah.
which was taken by very few people. And I had the knowledge, as I was saying earlier in this conversation, at least, that I knew the languages. And he told me afterwards, much later, MacDonald, when I met him, that he had been so impressed by the paper I wrote on that, that he asked the examiners whether it was in order to offer an Alpha Plus. Well, I did nothing like as well, I subsequently discovered, on any of the other papers, but to that extent, getting a starred first in Part 2 history was due to the fact that I brought to it the skills and the background knowledge which I'd acquired by doing Latin and Greek.
Did you work very hard?
No.
As an undergraduate?
No, I did in the third year, but in the first 2 years, no.
Were there teachers, lecturers, anyone teaching you who you remember now with particular affection or awe or interest? I mean, apart from the man who was constructing the trireme.
Apart from John Morrison, yes. No, I liked them, and I.
Were there any historians who you remember from that?
Yes, my supervisor was a man called Michael Vivian, who'd been in the Foreign Office, I think, and he published little or nothing in those days. Quite a lot of the best teaching dons didn't want to publish, didn't have to publish, or only did so if they chose. And I would say that I was very well taught by Michael Vivian.
What about other things? I mean, you at Eton, you don't seem to have branched out into drama or music or sort of hobby activities so much.
No.
Did you do anything in Trinity? Were you beginning to get involved?
No, I never tried to quite some of my contemporaries, and of course some went on to be very successful professional actors and musicians, but no, I never did.
Any? I mean, you didn't run around the countryside in hunting gear like some of the Trinity folks?
No, I didn't do that either. I've never. I was brought up to know how to shoot and fish, but I never, as they say, rode to hounds or wished to.
I mean, when you say shoot and fish, I mean, was your family one which went up to Scotland in August and fished and?
No, but my grandfather and my father both shot pheasants on the family's estate in Northumberland, as a matter of course. And I learnt to do it after the war, but then there was a real purpose, rationing and all that, and I would go out with my father, and we'd come back at the end of the day with 5 or 6 brace, as they say, of pheasants, who would be hung in the larder and eaten. And I went on shooting into quite late into my middle years, but I really came to dislike it when it became, as it is now, a rich man's sport, in which it has absolutely nothing to do with shooting for your own food. Yes, I haven't done it for years.
Were there any friends of that undergraduate period who you are still in touch with, or you remember?
Oh yes, indeed there are several of my lifelong friends. I met in those years.
Mm. And what about girls? Were you partying at that time?
First of all, as an only child, then 2 years national service, for most of which I was in the Suez Canal zone. And looking back, compared with certainly the present generation, and perhaps even the generation before that, we were curiously innocent. I mean, I bought into, as it were, the conventional thing that girls for when you grew up, and if you were lucky, you'd meet Miss Right and live happily ever after. And that was certainly the impression which I think genuinely, unlike what I was saying about the Christian religion, conveyed by housemasters and their wives. Who thought that this was the I think that didn't really change, possibly for people like me, until the 60s. So we were, to that extent, I don't know whether the right word is to use retarded, but I think yes, curiously innocent of what Edmund Wilson, talking about Proust, calls the inferno of the passions.
When did you do national service? Was it after?
Between school and university, yes.
Oh, well, we skipped over that then. For a lot of people, that seems to have been a pretty major event in their lives, meeting an entirely different swathe to the Etonians you were with. You were in the Suez.
Again, it was taken as a matter of course that I would go into an elite regiment, in other words, the Brigade of Guards. My father never suggested to me that I might want to learn to fly, after all, he having been an aviator, and nor did it occur to me to think of that. And he got in touch with a family friend who had been with the Grenadiers all through the Second World War, from Arnhem, from Dunkirk through Arnhem to the crossing of the Rhine, and come out with 2 DSOs. I was perfunctorily interviewed by somebody who came down to Eton. And again, I accepted this as completely a matter of course, so that was what I expected to do. And that's what I did. And these were the days before the treaty had been signed, as a result of which we evacuated the Canal Zone, and the attempt to get back in 1956 would have simply wasn't thought of. So, because I was a rather incompetent soldier, I was packed off to the brigade headquarters, where my principal duty was to play chess with the brigade major, who later became General Sir David Fraser, who consistently beat me. If I'd been older, I would have made quite sure, of course, that even if I could have beaten him, that I didn't. But as it was, I tried desperately, never succeeded. In the long afternoons when we had nothing to do, in beating him.
So it wasn't a mingling with the masses and a broad swathe of people.
No.
What about an interest in other civilizations? I mean, did it whet your appetite to learn more about the mystic Orient or anything?
As far as I can remember from the earliest days of taking holidays with my parents in England or on the continent, I mean, one holiday was about 10 or 11. We went and visited a succession of English cathedrals. Going to Paris, going to Art Expo, all that was again taken as completely a matter of course. And when I got a little bit of leave from the Suez Canal Zone, I went to Cairo and elsewhere in the Middle East, and yes, was extremely interested in seeing those places, looking at the museums, the mosques, climbing the Great Pyramid, and all those obvious things. Yes, I mean, I don't think it ever occurred to me at that stage that I might have an academic career which would give me a rather more serious interest in other societies and civilizations. But I was lucky that my uncle Stephen, the world-famous historian of the Crusades, gave me some introductions to people in the Middle East at that time. And I can remember being given a sort of personal tour of Jerusalem by Stuart Perrone, for example, as a result of this introduction. And yes, I enjoyed that sort of thing enormously.
And you mentioned your famous Sir Stephen uncle. Did he influence you in an interest in history, or?
I don't think so, no.
What was he like as a person?
He was elusive. He could be a very entertaining company, but I never felt that I had a close relationship with him, and he was very difficult to get to talk about himself, both because he wished to be extremely discreet about his private life, but also he was, I think he genuinely disliked being expected to take himself seriously. He told me once that the only reason that he started writing history was because he would have liked to be a novelist and he knew he didn't have the talent, and so he took to writing true stories. And he was, of course, a narrative historian who had no time whatever for Brodel and the salt trade coming up from the Sudan or whatever it was. But it's typical of him that when I quoted that back to him many years later, he denied that he's ever said it.
Yeah. Okay, well, after the undergraduate degree, what did you do then?
I was lucky to get one of, they were called Commonwealth Fellowships, but they were the Harkness Foundation. They went back to 1930s, some sort of heyday when there really was a special relationship. And 12 people a year who had just graduated would, if you got one of these, you could go for 2 years to the American university of your choice to do whatever you liked. And that gave me the opportunity, which, looking back on it, it was I think I'd use the word foolhardy, because I decided that what I would do was to use the first year, and I simply said I want to go to Harvard, and so the Harkness bureaucracy arranged it. That I spent the first year writing a dissertation for a Trinity Fellowship, again using my classical background, about two of Plato's later dialogues, with the firm intention, if I then got the research fellowship, to abandon the classics altogether and to become a sociologist, which I decided to do by the time I finished reading Part 2 history.
Why that? I mean, it seems quite a big leap. I mean, particularly in Cambridge, where sociology was not much encouraged, as you know, at that time. If there was one person who influenced me, it was Peter Laslett, who, of course, you know and remember. Likewise, who encouraged me in this. He was at Trinity then?
Yes, I was never formally taught by him, but he gave some informal seminars about the history of political thought, and I was one of this small group who attended those, and that's how I got to know him. Yes, that suggested to me how, if I was going to have the prospect of an academic career, which I didn't know if I would or if I would want to, but I would want to do it researching and teaching into something. I would never have used the word relevant, but and I still don't like to hear myself using it, but you will know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, political theory is one thing, but was he It was some time later that he formed the Cambridge group and wrote his The World We Have Lost and so on, but he was already interested in sociology.
Yes, he was. I mean, he was still known only as the editor of Locke.
Yeah.
And he then, of course, acquired a reputation which he retained of his edition of Locke's second treatise. Yes, I can't remember exactly when I then knew him from then on, and it is an extraordinary story. I mean, how against the opposition of the Cambridge History faculty, this innovative and spectacularly successful research group was set up by him and others and produced work, including the reconstruction of the population of Wrigley and Schofield, which is one of the great achievements of British 20th century social science.
This is the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure.
Yeah.
I mean, tell me something about Peter as a person. I mean, we both knew him.
I gave the address at his memorial service in Trinity, and was asked, because he couldn't be there, by John Eliot, then the Regius Professor at Oxford, of course, who'd been at Trinity, to send him a copy, which I was happy to do. And he wrote back saying nice things about it, and he thought that I'd captured Peter very well, but he went on to say he was the most exasperating of men. And it is true that Peter was in many ways his own worst enemy, because he had a kind of naive unself-consciousness about what he wanted to say or when he wanted to say it. And I remember talking about him to Hugh Trevor Roper, not that I had raised it, but Trevor Roper started talking about Laszlo, and I said, yes, indeed, I knew and liked it. He said, but you must admit he's a very silly man. And I thought, I'm not going to argue the toss with it. I said, yes, he is rather silly.
But a great man in many other ways.
But he was, yes. He was a good thing, capital G and T, and including, to myself as a mentor. I mean, I was always grateful to him.
So you spent the first year of the Harkness writing a research fellowship for Trinity College.
Yes.
That seems perverse. Were you in Harvard at the time?
Yes, and again, pure luck. I had no idea at the time, but in the second term when I was there, the late Will Owen, whom you probably knew,
Yes.
Who was then the foremost classical philosopher, or whatever he would have called himself in this country, was giving a seminar bearing directly on what I was trying to write about at Harvard. And I have sometimes wondered whether without that I would have succeeded. And as I subsequently discovered, one of my referees was Gilbert Ryle, and it was very much Ryle's approach, of which Owen succeeded to the Platonic dialogues, which found its way into my dissertation, which was subsequently published unamended, because I'd never done any more work on that. But I think I was undeservedly lucky in the way that my game plan came off, and I then spent the next year, first part of it at Columbia. This was the heyday of Robert K. Merton and Paul F. Lazarsfeld, names to conjure with to anybody who was doing sociology at that time, and then to spend the next semester in Berkeley, California, just by saying that's where I wanted to go, and the Harkness Foundation arranged it, attending seminars given by people like Reinhard Bendix, Marty Lipset, and somebody from whom I learnt quantitative methods called Hannon Selvin, who was a brilliant teacher of precisely those kind of techniques, which were then coming onto the curriculum of mainstream academic, particularly American sociology. So I then arrived back in England, qualified to my own satisfaction to undertake a major research project, which I was able to do thanks to the backing of Michael Young, then running the Institute of Community Studies.
You got the Trinity Fellowship, you didn't mention. Had you got it? Or?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and sooner than I would have expected. Otherwise, I think I would have been nail biting. I suddenly got a telegram from All Same John Morrison, my tutor, congratulating me on having been elected to a fellowship after only 1 year's research.
That's very good.
And it was.
For how long is that fellowship?
It's 4 years, but the whole point about it being that you can do whatever you like.
At what stage, I mean, someone who you've worked on a lot and been influenced by hugely is obviously Max Weber. I mean, was it when you were in America that you came across his work?
Yes, and like many other people, I mean, this was when Weber was very much on the top of the curriculum as interpreted by people like Talcott Parsons. I would now, of course, say seriously misinterpreted, and Reinhard Bendix.
Yes.
But it always seemed to me that the verdict of Raymond Arrell, who'd been writing about Weber before the Second World War, when he was totally unknown in Anglophone circles, as you might say, that Max Weber isn't only the greatest 20th century sociologist, he's the one. There is something unrivaled in terms of scope, influence, depth of scholarship and so forth. The fact that much of what he said has been overtaken is part of the way it goes, is anything to his credit.
I mean, when I lectured on the great thinkers, Tocqueville and Adam Smith and Montesquieu, when I came to Weber, I had to admit to my students that it was a mountain which I couldn't climb. I found him too difficult. I mean, you can teach it and you can understand a good deal of it, the foothills, but he seemed to be in the skies, in the clouds beyond, really. It's such depth and such width. Do you feel you comprehended Weber?
I have to say, I've never found him difficult in that sense. Writing about him, as you say, I've done and continued to do. It's because I think that various aspects of what he has said are still directly to the point in contemporary debates, both about substance and method. And of course, the iconic status, which his famous essay on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism still retains. I can't think of any parallel to it. I mean, there are, to use that metaphor, seminal articles we can all point to in spheres of our own particular interest. but that single article must be the most répandu. Any academic article outside the Einstein or in the natural sciences ever written.
Well, we're talking about Weber. How do you think his work has influenced your work?
I think he was basically right in a way that Marx was basically wrong about how to approach the whole agenda of comparative and historical sociology.
In what way was Marx wrong, and in what way was Weber right?
At its simplest, Marx, for all the deserved influence of the fundamental insight about the importance of, let's call it the economic base, never saw, as Weber did, that, as Weber put it, political relationships have their own, in German, Eigengesetzlichkeit. And if you accept, as I do, that basic to comparative and historical sociology is an understanding of the different ways in which power is exercised within societies of different kinds, down the ages and across the world, not to recognize that the political and the ideological are as powerful independent influences sometimes as the economic influences in classical Marxism always are, is a fundamental difference between the two. But as Weber on one occasion said of himself, I am much more of a materialist than so-and-so thinks. It would be quite unfair to him to suggest that he didn't recognize the force of the basic Marxist paradigm.
I mean, he seemed a great prophet, and yet one of his major prophecies relating to the decline of formal religions doesn't seem to have come true.
Well, that's a matter, as you know, probably better than I, of continuing debate. Prophecy, I mean, sociology is not a predictive science and never will be. And so prophecy is perhaps the right word. Inspired guesses are sometimes right. But sociologists are never going to be able to predict the future of societies any more than biologists to predict the future of species.
What I don't know whether you pay attention to his work on comparative religion and sociology, for instance, his work on China or on India. Do you find that helpful and stimulating?
Well, it's such an enormous field, and I have to say that in my own case, I was never as well read as I needed to be in not just as conventionally described the sociology, but also the anthropology of religion. Again, in terms of trying to find a way of comparing and contrasting the different ways in which societies of different kinds function and evolve. You have to come to terms with the influence of, let's call it broadly, religion. And again, as you will know as well or better than I, it's almost impossibly difficult to do that without getting involved in largely unproductive definitional disagreements about what constitutes religion as opposed to magic, as opposed to secular religion. Is Confucianism a religion, and so on? What you have to do is what Weber did, is to actually look and see what these various doctrines actually mean in terms of how behavior is influenced within the societies in which they are dominant. And to that extent, although the specialists say, as Weber himself knew that he would, that he made mistakes. Nevertheless, I think that the way he set about it is fundamentally well conceived.
I'm just concentrating on the criticisms of him. As I've mentioned, I think he's the greatest sociologist, but another one is that he was really the backbone of the European miracle school of interpretation, that there was something special to do with the Protestant ethic and so on. But all the other things, the legal system, the political system of Western Europe, which made it possible to have industrial and scientific revolutions, and that it hadn't occurred in the rest of the world. Recently, in the last 20 years or so, there have been a lot of people who say, well, look, he got it all wrong. Look at China, Japan, so on and so on. What do you feel about that?
I think that he did share the assumptions of his place and time, which can be fairly summed up as the word Eurocentric. But of course, when he looked around the world in the early years of the 20th century, it was impossible to deny which way the relationships of power, geopolitical, economic, international, whatever you put it, were actually running at that time. The days were long past when, as he knew as well as anybody, Europe was a barbarian outpost on one flank of the Eurasian landmass, far behind, by any measure you like, societies elsewhere. So that there was a problem, or a question to be answered, about the rise of the West, precisely because of the earlier achievements of other societies, I think was almost unavoidable for somebody of his time to begin by approaching it that way. And interestingly, if you read Jared Diamond, there's something of the same assumption in a more updated form, which underlies his concern to answer his New Guinea informant about why aren't we bringing cargo to you white men? Why is it the other way around? Well, that question is as relevant as ever in today's world.
One person who I think started off with a lot of sympathy but then came to attack on this particular point a lot was someone I wondered whether you had discussed much with, and that's Jack Goody, because he's written a series of comparative books on this subject.
I've never actually talked to Jack about it, but it seems to me that he's absolutely right. I mean, I assume, I'm not competent to judge, but I assume that he can authenticate all the claims he makes for what was going on in India and China that Weber either didn't know about or underplayed. But I don't think it reverses the fundamental assumption, as I say, just looking around the world and saying, who dominates whom?
Well, the one slight caveat on that is Japan, because if I've read Weber to see what he said about Japan, he said very little. And he didn't really realise that Japan had just defeated Russia and China and had had an industrial revolution, was one of the biggest powers in the world. He seems to have more or less missed that.
I don't think he ever did give Japan the attention which, with hindsight, he would undoubtedly agree that he should have, yes. And Japan, which I've only visited twice, but I was very struck the first time I went there. I came back by way of Hong Kong, and talking to Hong Kong Chinese, I've never been to People's Republic, about the Japanese. It was like talking to a fellow European. And Ron Daw, the sociologist whom I know and like and hugely admire, who's often the leading British expert on modern Tokugawa and up to contemporary Japan, certainly shares that view that the Japanese are very unlike any other society with which you might be tempted to liken them, including our own Western societies, and in the same way that we will never know what Weber would have said about the rise of National Socialism in Germany, where some people think that he would have been, should we say, unsound about that. I don't think there's no point in speculating what he would have had to say had he foreseen what the history of Japan would be during the 20th century.
When did he die? Because
1920.
by then,
The influenza epidemic after the First World War.
because by then Japan was already pretty formidable. It wasn't a matter of what it was going to be. It had already gone through the great change. But I mean, many people don't know anything about Japan. It's not surprising he didn't know much. Turning from him to others, I mean, he's had a huge influence on you. Are there any other thinkers who really you would regard as, if you had to take your books to a desert island and choose the thinkers who had most influenced you alongside Weber, who else would be there?
No, he is in a class of his own, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, of course, we're all influenced by Marx. You can't not be, and to some extent also by Durkheim, particularly in terms of setting the agenda for the study of religion. And although it always seemed to me that Evans Pritchard was right in saying it's Durkheim and not the, quote, savage who elevated society into a god, I think that is a very telling criticism. But nevertheless, I would have thought there would be general agreement that, quotes, we owe to Durkheim insights about the nature and workings of religion and collective systems of belief, which have passed permanently into the sociological curriculum.
So those are the three great figures
Yes,
in your life.
yes.
Coming back to, I mean, your own progress, you'd got a research fellowship at Trinity, and then what happened?
Well, this is, I'd like to be as brief as possible about it. I mean, I had the opportunity because to do a deal with my father on the one hand, and in due course my college on the other, that I would, once I'd qualified myself sufficiently to become a non-executive director of the family's, and in due course chairman of the family's shipping business, and that I could also have a part-time academic position, which first of all I did briefly as a part-time visiting reader in sociology in the new University of Sussex. But anyway, I have been able to combine an academic career and a commercial career on my own terms in a way which again is purely fortuitous. It's luck. And I will never know whether my academic work is better or worse as a result. But I've never regretted, from the point of view of personal interest and satisfaction, being able to combine the two.
How, practically, it's probably changed over time, but how practically do you combine them? I mean, do you spend half a week on one and half a week on the other, or how do you do it?
Well, all those days are over, and in practice, of course, it varied with circumstances. But once I was appointed by the college to a senior research fellowship without tenure, but renewable if I could go on every 5 years, producing work which referees not chosen by me told the college council they ought to support, then as long as the result 5 years later was up to snuff, as you might say, how much of that time, depending what was going on, including I did, as you'll presumably know from my CV, do other things in what's rather misleadingly called public life, including chairing a Royal Commission on the criminal justice system and being a regulator of financial services, which again, pure luck as far as I can see, but it gave me some very, very interesting times including seeing at first hand in a way that I couldn't possibly have done by getting a research grant from a foundation to research into the workings of the city or of the criminal justice system. But yes, I often wonder whether it actually made any difference to the conclusions I've advanced in my academic writings about the workings of the world.
Tell me more about the Commission on Criminal Justice. What was the purpose of the Commission, and what was your main finding?
It was set up in the aftermath of the acquittal of the Birmingham Six. I take it I didn't need to summarise all that. I got a telephone call out of the blue from the then Solicitor General, whom I knew, who rang up one Saturday morning and said, "I want to come around and talk to you about a government thing," as he put it. He arrived with a locked briefcase on a chain, fished into it and said, "The government would like you to chair a Royal Commission with the following terms of reference." I was completely, as you might say, gobsmacked. He explained to me, I didn't say exactly why I'd been chosen, and for all I know, other people had been chosen first and turned it down. You never discover about these things. But they needed somebody. I was then, as a hereditary in the House of Lords, on the crossbenches. I had no political affiliation. I had no vested interest of any kind in the workings of the law. I did have some experience by then of relations with government on public bodies. And when I got over my initial surprise, I asked for a fortnight to think about it and to clear, because I knew it was going to be much more demanding than they tell you. You know, when you take on these things, you'll be able to do it in 2 days a week. F that. Having got the clearance I asked for from the people I thought I need to say, look, I may be going to be doing this for 2 years. And, does that change your view of what you expect me to do for you? I said yes.
And what was your main
the most widely known result was the establishment, as we had recommended, we the Commission, on the setting up of an independent body to review possible miscarriages of justice and refer them back to the Court of Appeal. And behind that, there's a long history. I mean, I could give you another hour on that, and I think to be as brief as possible, what I did come to realise, not to my surprise, was that if you are asked to make recommendations about changes to a large, complex, inherited set of institutions and the associated ideological and practical assumptions that go with them, there is absolutely no point in recommending something which you know in practice no government would be able, even if it wished to implement. And the one other jurisdiction that I took my commission to see, we arranged, we spent some time in Scotland, and there are features of the Scottish criminal justice system which, in our view, I'm not speaking only for myself, are superior to the system in England and Wales, couldn't be implemented without rewriting the history of the institutions concerned. And the moment you start thinking through even relatively minor alterations to the way in which criminal trials are conducted, the way in which, yes, because we weren't dealing with magistrates' courts, we were only dealing with offences which come before a jury, that it's like the old image of pushing the balloon in one direction and then something pops out in another. And I hope, but I don't know, that our recommendations taken together have had the effect of moving the criminal justice system in England and Wales slightly away from the highly adversarial system, which it still is, not in the direction of a continental European system, which would be not only impossible but undesirable, but in ways which makes the risk either of miscarriages of justice or, on the contrary, of jurors letting off people who are palpably guilty of serious offences slightly less. But it's one of those counterfactual speculations. I will never know, nor will anybody else, whether in fact those of our recommendations which were accepted by government, and most of them were, did have that effect. But what I do remember, just as a postscript to this, was being rung up some months after by the BBC and a young sounding woman saying, "Wouldn't you like to come on television in order to say how frustrating it is that the government sets up a royal commission and then does nothing about it?" To which I said, "You evidently don't realise that more of the recommendations of the royal commissions I chaired have been accepted by government than any other royal commission since the Second World War." And I have to say I enjoyed the long pause which followed very much indeed.
And you didn't appear on the television.
And I did not appear on television.
Coming back to your own work,
Yes.
I often ask people if they were to be remembered for 3 ideas or 3 books or articles, what would you select as what you think is the
That's
most...
not a question I've ever asked myself, but I would say first that I think that the book which gave me my reputation, which you referred to, which
relative deprivation
and social justice, that it was an attempt to bring to bear what I'd learnt in America under the name of what was then and still sometimes is called reference group theory. And basically it's a social psychological insight, if that's what it is, yes. And I learnt it really from Robert K. Merton. And particularly also it fitted in with his idea, it was very congenial to me, of what he called theories of the middle range. Merton, like many other American sociologists, was never prepared to come out and say that Talcott Parsons was an emperor without any clothes, which I think he was. The only person who said that was George Homans, his colleague at Harvard, a splendid, robust Yankee behaviorist sociologist who used, whenever challenged, to say he couldn't be accused of kicking a man when he's down, which was perfectly true, because Parsons survived effective attacks from many other quarters, including a devastating critique by the philosopher Max Black, published in 1960. But by that time, and he was so well established at Harvard, it was unthinkable, I think, that he should be dethroned. But Merton, as I say, I found his approach, broadly speaking, very sympathetic. And that book was an attempt to apply ideas which I got, if I got them from anybody, from him, about that if you want to understand the attitudes that, quote, ordinary people have towards the inequalities of power of whatever kinds in the societies in which they live. What is absolutely crucial is to get into and to understand their own frames of reference and comparison. And I didn't know what, I started with no preconceived ideas once I got the funding, thanks to Michael Young, to do a national sample survey, pilot a questionnaire, devise it, recruit the interviewers and so on. I had absolutely no idea what I would find out. As I say, I had no preconceived notions. But what I did find out has been influential beyond my highest expectations. And that book, which is, I think you know from when we talked about it before, Edmund Leach denounced in the New Statesman, of which he said, no wonder the Russians think sociology is a bourgeois absurdity, unquote. I'm sorry, he hasn't lived to see as I have. It overpraised to the extent that it has been as a classic, a great work of British 20th century sociology. It isn't those things, but that is what I would first say. I would only have one other, which is that the work I've been doing for the last 20 years or so, which really came from realizing that the idea of evolution as the fundamental process of change applies no less to human cultures and societies than it does to animal species and so on. I mean, that's an enormous field. We are beginning, the academic community, are beginning, I think, to recognize in the behavioral sciences, particularly in the United States, that the evolutionary process is fundamental in psychology and sociology in a different way, but it's nevertheless recognizably the same fundamental insight about the nature of variation and selection of information which affects behavior in the phenotype. And to the extent that I'm still trying to propagate that and to use it and to publish, that I would say is the second. I don't have a third.
Well, you wrote a great trilogy of sociological works.
Yes, of which I regret that I was preoccupied. I didn't need to write a preliminary volume about methodology.
It's used a lot. I mean, it was very helpful in
Well,
teaching.
but it was trying to make the very simple point made in parallel for quite separate reasons by Quentin Skinner in trying to change the way in which the history of ideas is done, that you have to ask what your chosen author or authority or researcher is doing in putting forward the conclusions you're being asked to accept. And it still amazes me that what seems to me a rudimentary distinction between just talking now in terms of sociology, trying to find out what happened and why it happened, and then comparing it how it happened in different societies, is an exercise quite separate from saying what it was like for the people whose experiences they are, which is in turn quite different from saying whether what is going on is a good thing or a bad one. And the three get indistinguishably muddled up with each other in far too many writings under the name of sociology. And I do find it puzzling that, as I see it, the progress of the subject is still retarded in ways which I would have thought would have been outdated decades ago.
Returning to your current work and work you've been doing on evolutionary theory, I wondered, I've recently been thinking about the scientific revolution and its impact largely based on the work of Carl Jaspers. And it occurred to me that in some ways, maybe he and certainly I begin to think of it as a break with the evolutionary process, because, or a half break. That is to say, evolution works by random variation and selective retention. What you do with science is that you speed up the process. I mean, it may be the same process, but by design and by experimental methods and hypotheses, you hurry up evolution by testing many variations and selecting the best outcomes.
Yes.
And therefore, in one sense it's the same, in another it seems to be an escape from evolution.
I think what we have to accept is that you have to start from recognizing that the origins of an innovation, which you try to explain historically, if you're interested, are never any guide to its effect on the future. So that if what you're trying to do is understand how large-scale change, cultural or institutional, comes about in societies of different kinds, you have to treat the triggers, if you like that metaphor, as quasi-random. I mean, not random in the technical sense, unless somebody decides whether to go to war by spinning a dice. Because you will understand nothing about the long-term effects by looking at the causal antecedents of the novel practice or belief or custom which sets it off.
So if you take two examples, say the discovery of the vacuum by Boyle, or the discovery of the supercondenser, or the improved condenser for the steam engine, what you mean is that the reasons for investigating these and making them was no predictor of what effect.
And you can find, it almost seems to be a specialism among historians of science and technology, that it's very often the case that the most remarkable and ultimately influential innovation is either ignored or misused for a long time after it was initially discovered. I mean, as I've come to see it, if you want to explain social and cultural change, you have to get used to seeing those things exactly as a biologist sees a tsunami, if you like, something quite outside perhaps outside isn't quite the right way to put it, but something independent of the process you're trying to understand, which comes in and very often completely diverts the evolutionary trajectory, by which I mean the way in which the process of variation and selection is determining, if you're a sociologist, the institutions and the associated beliefs which you're trying to explain.
Another current example which many people are more aware of would be on Christmas Day or New Year's Day 1990, the first use of the hypertext markup language, which was the foundation of the World Wide Web, and no one could have predicted what what that would do, but it wasn't ignored much. I mean,
no, and sometimes these things have instant effects, but no, as Humphrey Lyttelton, when he was asked about the future, what's the future of jazz, he said, if I knew, I'd be playing it. And I think that applies directly to what we're talking about.
Finally, tell me a little more about your family. I mean, you have a distinguished son who's also a sociologist in Cambridge.
He'd be horrified to be called a sociologist. I mean, he's
Political science.
he's a historian of political thought who now holds a chair in politics under the new dispensation.
In what ways has your family, your nuclear family, influenced your work and life?
I'm not aware that they have.
Because often I end an interview and afterwards people say, "Oh, you should have asked me about my wife."
Well, my wife has had a career of her own, as a result of which she was damed a few years ago. It's in. She's never thought of herself as an academic, and I can't remember when she last read seriously anything which I published, and I don't think my son David reads what I publish, and he certainly doesn't share my interest in to take an area in which I don't work in, but where I think something, hesitate to use the word revolutionary, but the fact that or the idea that culture evolves in a sense strongly analogous but not reducible to natural selection. There's a volume of proceedings of the Royal Society published I think in 2012 after a conference which I was there only chairing one of the sessions by invitation. I was the only sociologist in a room of hundreds of people, and here were the international big shots of this development, and I think it's now very difficult for anybody to argue that culture defined as information affecting phenotype acquired by social learning and imitation, both in human and in some other species, works in a way that, as I was saying, is strongly analogous but not reducible to natural selection. It's much more controversial. I mean, if you say that, I have to say to some anthropologists and some sociologists, the prejudice, for understandable reasons, they still think in terms of social Darwinism, which is a set of doctrines not only long discredited but positively refuted by precisely developments in evolutionary theory which post-date the heyday of this misleading, quite apart from pernicious, set of doctrines which were not due to Darwin himself. So I mean there's a huge backlog of misunderstanding and prejudice which still has to be overcome. But it is being overcome, I think, particularly in the United States.
Well, I think we've more or less, I think we've covered most things, but there are many others, like your presidentship of the British Academy and so on. But is there anything you would have liked me to have asked you, which I haven't asked you about?
No, I don't think there is. No, not that I can think of.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.
No, it's interesting.